There was a moment, standing in the middle of a grocery store in America, when I realized something I never thought I'd admit. I wanted to leave. Not because anything was wrong, not because anyone had been unkind. I simply didn't feel like I belonged there anymore. I remember looking around at rows and rows of brightly lit shelves, shopping carts rolling past me, people hurrying from one aisle to the next without making eye contact. Just a few years earlier, that store had been completely ordinary. Now it felt strangely unfamiliar. For a second, I caught myself wondering where they kept the rice I'd been buying every week. I caught myself letting out a quiet laugh, not because I found it, but because I remembered I wasn't in the Philippines anymore. That tiny thought stopped me in my tracks. Somewhere along the way, without even noticing, I'd changed, and once that thought settled in, I knew there was no going back to the person I'd been before. 3 months earlier, when my plane touched down in America, I expected the hardest part to be the flight. After all, nearly 20 hours in the air would wear anyone out. I figured I'd be tired, maybe a little emotional, mostly happy to see familiar places again. Instead, the moment I walked through the airport doors, I felt something I couldn't explain. Everything looked exactly the way I remembered. The signs, the rental car counters, the smell of coffee drifting through the terminal, even the announcements echoing overhead. Everything looked exactly the same. I was the only thing that felt different. My sister wrapped me in a hug before I even spotted her face. "There you are," she laughed. "I've missed you." "I've missed you too." And I meant it. She looked exactly the same, maybe a few more gray hairs, maybe I'd picked up a few myself. We loaded my suitcase into her car, and before we'd even left the airport parking lot, we were talking as though no time had passed. She filled me in on the neighbors, who had moved away, who had retired, which restaurants had closed, who'd become grandparents. I listened. I nodded along. I asked questions. But every now and then I'd catch myself staring out the window instead. The roads seemed wider than I remembered. The traffic felt faster. Even the billboards seemed enormous. "You okay?" she finally asked. "I'm fine." "You've gotten awfully quiet." "I think I'm just tired." That wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. What unsettled me was this. I felt like I was visiting a place I'd once known by heart. I'd been living in the Philippines for several years before this trip, long enough that daily routines no longer felt new. The early mornings, the sound of roosters before sunrise, stopping at the same little fruit stand, knowing which neighbor always waved first, remembering which bakery sold out of fresh bread before lunchtime. None of it felt exciting anymore. It had simply become part of everyday life. The strange thing about routine is, you rarely notice it while you're living it. I hadn't gone back to America because I wanted to move home. A family matter needed my attention. It wasn't the kind of situation I could solve over a video call, so I packed a suitcase, locked my front door, told my neighbors I'd be back before too long, and boarded the plane. I remember thinking, it'll be nice to spend a few weeks back in the States. I even made a list of things I wanted to do. Visit my favorite diner, drive along roads I'd known for decades, walk through the hardware store where I used to spend far too much time looking at tools I didn't need, see family, catch up with old friends, maybe buy a few things that were harder to find overseas. It sounded comforting, familiar, easy. I had no idea that familiarity and comfort aren't always the same thing. The first few days were exactly what I'd expected. Family dinners, too much food, stories I'd already heard mixed with new ones I'd somehow missed. Everyone wanted to know what my days looked like now. "Do you still like living over there? Do you think you'll ever move back? Do you miss America?" Those questions came up almost every day. I'd usually pause for a second before answering. I missed the people. Because that was true. I missed birthdays, holiday dinners, watching my niece and nephew grow older, laughing around the same table we'd shared for years. But every time someone asked if I'd move back, I found myself hesitating just a little too long. Not because I wanted to avoid the question, because I honestly didn't know how to explain what had happened to me. How do you explain that another country hadn't changed who you were? It had simply reminded you of the person you'd forgotten you could become. The first clue that something felt different didn't happen during a family gathering. It happened in a parking lot. I'd borrowed my sister's car to pick up a few things. Nothing unusual, just a quick trip. As I pulled into a shopping center, I found myself slowing down for a man pushing a cart across the lane. He looked up, I raised a hand and motioned for him to go ahead. He hurried across without looking at me again. I sat there for a second. Not because he'd done anything wrong, because I'd expected something I couldn't quite explain. Back in the Philippines, little moments like that happened all the time. A wave, a nod, a quick smile, sometimes a simple "good morning." It wasn't guaranteed, but it happened often enough that I'd stopped noticing it, until it wasn't there. I laughed to myself. You're overthinking this. Maybe I was. So I grabbed my shopping basket and headed inside. The store was enormous. I remembered it being big, I just didn't remember it feeling endless. One aisle after another, hundreds of choices for the same product, rows of bright packaging competing for attention. I stood in front of the coffee for nearly 5 minutes, not because I couldn't find what I wanted, because there were too many options. Someone walked by and joked, "Need any help deciding?" I laughed softly. I think I forgot how many choices we have. He laughed and kept walking. A few minutes later, I reached into my pocket without thinking. My fingers searched for pesos. Instead, I pulled out a few folded dollar bills. I actually chuckled. The cashier looked up. Something funny? I guess my brain's still on the other side of the Pacific. She smiled politely. I bet that happens. Maybe she was just being nice, but I wondered how many people had ever felt that way. That evening, my sister asked if I wanted to order dinner. Pizza? I agreed. We sat around the kitchen table waiting for it to arrive. When the delivery driver knocked, I instinctively stood up. I'll grab it. As I reached for my wallet, I froze for half a second. I wasn't calculating the exchange rate. I was wondering if I should round the tip the way I had overseas. Old habits, tiny habits, the kind you don't notice until they're suddenly out of place. My sister noticed I was lost in thought again. What? I keep catching myself doing things automatically. Like what? I still think in pesos. She laughed. I guess that makes sense. It feels strange. Being back? I nodded, but not in the way I expected. She didn't press me. She simply changed the subject. Looking back, I'm grateful she did, because I wasn't ready to explain something I didn't fully understand myself. A few days later, I drove across town to visit an old friend. We'd worked together years before. The kind of friendship where you don't need to speak often to pick up right where you left off. He greeted me with a hug and said, "You haven't changed a bit." I looked down at my coffee. If only that were true. We spent hours talking. Old stories, old coworkers, people we'd lost touch with, people we'd lost entirely. Eventually, he leaned back in his chair. So, when are you moving back? There it was again. Not, are you? When? I stared into my coffee for a moment. I don't think I am. He looked genuinely surprised. Really? You've been gone that long? I guess I have. I figured eventually everyone comes back. I used to think that too. He nodded slowly. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then he asked a question nobody else had asked. "What do you miss over there?" Not, "What do you like?" Not, "Is it cheaper?" Just, "What do you miss?" I answered before I even thought about it. "The mornings." He smiled. "The mornings?" I know that probably sounds strange. "No." "Tell me." So I did. I told him about waking up before the sun got too high, walking outside with a cup of coffee, hearing birds before traffic, watching people begin their day instead of racing through it, knowing the woman at the fruit stand would ask how I'd been if she hadn't seen me for a couple of days, watching children walk to school, hearing laughter drift through the neighborhood. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, just ordinary mornings. When I finished, he looked at me for a long time. Then he quietly said, "I don't think you're talking about mornings." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I think you're talking about peace." A few days later, my sister asked if I'd considered staying longer. "You could always extend your visit." I looked at her. "You mean move back?" She shrugged. "You wouldn't be the first person." For the first time since I'd landed, I actually considered it. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe I'd romanticized my years overseas. Maybe coming back was exactly what I needed. Peace. Such a simple word. Yet I'd spent years chasing bigger things. A better job, a larger house, more savings, more security, more plans. Nobody ever tells you peace can be so quiet you almost overlook it. A larger house, more savings, more security, more plans. At some point, I'd forgotten to ask a much simpler question. What kind of day do I actually enjoy living? Not once, not on vacation, every day. The answer had quietly changed, and I hadn't noticed until I came back. That evening, my sister found me sitting alone on the back porch. She stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to me without saying a word. We sat there for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees. Finally, she asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you actually happy over there?" I looked at her. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged. "Because I honestly can't tell if you're trying to convince us or convince yourself." That one caught me off guard. Nobody had ever said it out loud before. I didn't answer right away. She wasn't accusing me. She was trying to understand. "When you first left," she continued, "I thought you were running away." I stared into my coffee. "Maybe part of me was." She nodded. "And now?" I thought about that for a long moment. Now I think I was running toward something. She tilted her head. "What's the difference?" I let out a quiet breath. "When you're running away, you spend all your time looking over your shoulder." I paused. "When you're running toward something, eventually you stop looking back." She didn't respond immediately. Then she quietly asked, "So, if I told you to stay here, would you?" I looked across the yard. The swing set we'd played on as kids was gone. The old maple tree was twice the size I remembered. Everything looked familiar, but it no longer felt like it belonged to my everyday life. I finally answered, "I'd stay longer if you needed me, but I wouldn't stay forever." She nodded slowly. "I think I understand now." We finished our coffee in silence. For the first time since I'd landed, I stopped wondering whether I'd made the right decision. I already knew the answer. The rest of my visit felt different after that conversation. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood where I'd lived for years. The sidewalks were exactly as I remembered. The trees had grown taller. A few houses had fresh paint. A couple I'd never seen before were walking a golden retriever. Everything looked familiar enough that I should have felt completely at ease. Instead, I felt like I was walking through an old photograph. Beautiful, comforting, but no longer mine. I kept telling myself the feeling would pass. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe jet lag had settled into something heavier. Maybe I simply needed more time. After all, I'd spent years building a routine somewhere else. Of course, coming back would feel a little strange. That's what I told myself. Then, one afternoon, my sister asked if I wanted to ride along while she ran a few errands. Sure. Neither of us had anything pressing to do. It seemed like a good excuse to spend time together. We stopped at a pharmacy, then a hardware store, then a large home improvement center. As we wandered through the aisles, I caught myself looking at plants, not because I needed any, because they reminded me of the little pots sitting outside my house in the Philippines. I wondered if anyone had remembered to water them. It wasn't an important thought, just one that appeared without warning. My sister noticed me staring. "You thinking about buying one?" I shook my head. "No." "Then what?" "I was wondering if my neighbors are taking care of mine." She laughed. "You've been gone, what, 2 weeks?" "Just about." "They're probably fine." "I'm sure they are." But the fact that I'd worried at all surprised me. A few years earlier, I wouldn't have thought twice about leaving a house behind for a while. Now I was wondering about a handful of plants. Funny how attachment sneaks into your life. It rarely announces itself. Later that week, my nephew invited me to one of his baseball games. I hadn't watched him play in years. He'd grown taller, faster, more confident. Sitting in the bleachers, surrounded by parents cheering every swing, reminded me how much I'd missed. Some moments can't be replaced with video calls. When the game ended, he jogged over, still catching his breath. "So, when are you leaving again?" There was no sadness in his voice, just curiosity. I told him the date. He nodded. "I wish you lived closer." "So do I." That answer hurt more than I expected, because it was true. I wished I could be in 2 places at once. I wished I could have Sunday dinners with my family and Monday mornings back in the Philippines. I wished distance wasn't real, but wishing doesn't change geography. Sometimes every choice gives you something and asks you to give something up. That's simply the price of building a different chapter. One evening, I sat alone on the back porch after everyone had gone inside. The summer air felt familiar. The smell of freshly cut grass drifted across the neighborhood. Somewhere nearby, a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically. I closed my eyes. Almost instinctively, I started listening for roosters. There weren't any. I opened my eyes and laughed at myself. If someone had told me years ago that I'd actually miss being woken up by roosters, I would have told them they were crazy. Back then, I used to joke about them. Now, their absence felt strangely loud. It's funny what becomes part of your definition of normal, not because you choose it, because you live alongside it long enough. As my visit continued, I began noticing something else. Nobody was rushing me to leave. Nobody was trying to convince me to stay forever either. My family had stopped asking if I was moving back. Instead, they started asking different questions. "How's your neighbor doing? Is the rainy season starting? Have you found that bakery you always talk about? What are you planting in your yard these days?" Little questions. Questions that assumed I'd be returning. Gradually, without any dramatic conversation, even they had started accepting that my life existed somewhere else now. That realization brought an unexpected kind of peace. Not because everyone suddenly agreed with my decision, because they no longer needed to. Families don't always need perfect understanding. Sometimes they simply need time. A few days before my flight, my sister and I went out for breakfast. Just the two of us. No errands, no schedule, no interruptions. Halfway through the meal, she put her coffee down and looked at me. "I owe you an apology." I looked up. "For what?" "When you first moved, I thought you'd be back in 6 months." I gave a small nod. "I know. I never told you because I didn't want to argue." She paused. "I just couldn't imagine why anyone would leave everything familiar." "I couldn't either. Until you did." I nodded. She looked out the window for a moment before speaking again. "You seem," she searched for the right word, "lighter." I laughed softly. "Lighter?" "Yeah. Less worried. You smile more. You don't seem like you're constantly trying to prove something anymore." Her words caught me completely off guard, because I hadn't noticed that change in myself. We spend so much time looking in mirrors. Rarely do we see ourselves the way other people do. Sometimes, the people who've known us the longest notice our changes before we ever will. Driving home that morning, I found myself thinking about the person I'd been before I moved overseas. That version of me wasn't unhappy, but there was always another finish line, another goal, another reason to postpone enjoying today until tomorrow looked a little better. I kept believing contentment was waiting somewhere ahead. Instead, it had quietly been hiding inside ordinary days. Morning walks, neighbors who knew my name, coffee outside, conversations that weren't rushed, the feeling that there was nowhere else I needed to be. I hadn't moved across the world to find a perfect place. I'd simply stumbled into a different rhythm, and without realizing it, I'd started keeping time to it. The night before my flight, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was anxious, because my suitcase was already sitting by the front door. Every trip has that moment. The packing is finished, the alarms are set, there's nothing left to do except wait. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood by the window. The neighborhood was completely still. A porch light glowed across the street. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn drifted through the night. I hadn't heard that sound in years. For a moment, I simply stood there, listening. It reminded me of another sound, the rain on our metal roof in the Philippines, the kind of steady rain that could last all afternoon. I'd spent countless days sitting under the covered porch with a cup of coffee, watching it fall. I hadn't thought about those afternoons in weeks. Now I missed them. Not because they were exciting, because they had become part of who I was. The next morning, my family drove me to the airport. Nobody cried. Nobody made emotional speeches. Maybe we'd all learned something over the years. Goodbyes don't always have to feel final. My nephew hugged me before climbing back into the car. "See you soon." "I hope so." He grinned. "Next time, maybe we'll come visit you." "I'd like that." As they pulled away from the curb, I stood there for a moment with my suitcase beside me, watching until the car disappeared around the corner. Then I turned toward the terminal. Something about that moment felt familiar. Not because I'd been there before, because I'd walked through those same doors years earlier, heading in the opposite direction. Back then, I was leaving behind everything I'd known. This time, I was leaving behind people I loved. Those are two very different things. Airports have a strange way of slowing your thoughts. You're surrounded by thousands of people, Yet somehow they become one of the quietest places in your mind. Everyone is going somewhere. Everyone is leaving something behind. Sitting at my gate, I watched families hug goodbye. Business travelers typing on laptops. Children pressed against the windows, waving at airplanes. It made me wonder how many people were carrying invisible versions of the same question. Where do I belong now? Years ago, I would have answered that question without hesitation. Now, I wasn't so sure. And strangely, that uncertainty no longer frightened me. About halfway through the flight, I opened the entertainment screen. Hundreds of movies, television shows, music. I stared at it for a while before turning it off. Instead, I looked out the window. Somewhere below, the Pacific stretched farther than I could see. It occurred to me that this ocean hadn't changed. It connected the same two countries it always had. The difference wasn't the distance. The difference was the person crossing it. When the plane finally landed in the Philippines, I waited patiently for everyone else to stand up first. No rush. There never seemed to be much point. I collected my suitcase and walked through the terminal. The warm air hit me the moment the automatic doors opened. Humid, familiar, comforting. Without realizing it, I took a long, slow breath. Not because I was on vacation, because I was relieved to be back. A taxi driver called out, asking if I needed a ride. I nodded. As he loaded my suitcase into the trunk, he asked the same question drivers always seem to ask. Long trip? It was. Welcome back. I thanked him and climbed into the taxi. It wasn't until we were pulling away that those words settled in. He hadn't said welcome, he'd said welcome back. But somehow they settled deep inside me. The drive home felt almost ordinary. The motorcycles weaving through traffic, small roadside stores opening for the day, people sweeping in front of their homes, laundry hanging outside, children laughing as they walked to school. None of it felt unusual anymore. And that's when it happened. Before I even realized it, I whispered to myself, "It's good to be home." The words came out so naturally that I didn't even notice them at first. A few seconds later, I repeated them quietly. Home. Not my vacation, not my second home, not the place I moved to, just home. No ceremony, no dramatic realization. Just one honest sentence spoken to nobody but myself. Later that afternoon, I unlocked my front door. The house smelled exactly the way I'd left it, a little warm, a little dusty, comfortably familiar. I set my suitcase down in the hallway and opened the windows. Almost immediately, a breeze drifted through the house. Outside, I heard someone call my name. One of the neighbors had noticed I was back. I stepped outside. "You're home!" "I am. We were wondering when you'd return." We talked for a few minutes, nothing important, just everyday conversation. How the weather had been, who'd stopped by, what I'd missed. Eventually, I went back inside and made myself a cup of coffee. I carried it onto the porch and sat down in my favorite chair. For a long time, I didn't think about America. Not because I'd forgotten it, because I didn't need to compare the two anymore. Both places had shaped me. Both had given me people I loved. Both would always matter, but only one of them felt like the place where my ordinary days belonged. And sometimes, that's the only definition of home we ever really need.